The windows of Broome Street let in a pale, reluctant winter light. Outside, the noise of Manhattan remained distant, softened by snow and steel. But inside apartment 5A, time had stilled. There was no sound but the hush of central heating and the faint murmur of a massage therapist setting down her bag. On the floor, stretched diagonally across the bed, lay Heath Ledger, limbs relaxed, face turned slightly upward, eyes closed. He might have looked asleep, if not for the peculiar stillness that settles on the newly departed. It was January 22nd, 2008. At exactly 3:36 p.m., emergency services received a call, an unconscious man, not breathing. But that call wasn't the first. Before dialing 911, the masseuse had found his cell phone and called a name in the contacts. Not family, not the building manager, not even the police. The call went to Mary Kate Olsen, an actress, friend, and enigma in her own right. She didn't answer, so the masseuse tried again. Then once more. Then came the paramedics. In that pause, a delay of minutes, precious and irreversible a question took root that would never fully die. Why? The apartment was neat, strangely so. On the nightstand sat a scattering of prescription bottles, some open, some closed. A glass of water half drunk. His feet were bare. A script for a new film rested on the coffee table. Dog-eared, with a line circled in pen. The note was trivial, a reminder to call someone about rehearsal, but something about it felt too quiet, too final. In the mirror across the room, his reflection no longer lingered. Just space, just absence. Ledger had been living here between shoots. The loft, with its brick walls and wide windows, had a monastic calm about it. It was a place to disappear into, a place for a man who couldn't sleep, who roamed at night, restless and unraveling. Friends had spoken of his insomnia, how it chewed at him, turning hours into ghosts. A few weeks earlier, in an interview, he'd said, "I barely sleep. I'm always tossing and turning." He'd tried sleeping pills, they said, then tried others. Medications stacked atop one another in silent succession, each one promising rest, none delivering peace. And yet none were supposed to be lethal. Not alone. Not even together, unless the combination was just so. The strange detail that echoed louder than any siren was this: he hadn't been alone long. He'd spoken to his sister the night before, told her he was fine, said he was tired, but excited about upcoming work. No cries for help, no signs of despair, just stillness, come suddenly, like a curtain falling in an empty theater. Time of death was later estimated between 1 Purdue Duizam and 2:45 p. Ma'am, though no one knows for sure. The masseuse had arrived for her appointment around 3 p. Let in by the housekeeper. She knocked. No answer. She called his name. Nothing. She tried the bedroom door. Unlocked. Then everything unspooled. It's easy, in hindsight, to see symbolism in that frozen moment, the half-drunk water, the script with its circled line, the paused clocks, the quiet mirror. But symbolism is the comfort of the living. Ledger was gone, and the world had just begun to notice. Outside, sirens wailed too late. Snow fell silently on the city that never sleeps. Inside the apartment, time had already stopped. In the months before his death, Heath Ledger became a paradox, more radiant than ever, yet visibly fraying around the edges. The Hollywood spotlight loved him for his wild charm, that crooked smile always a little off-center, as if he were listening to music no one else could hear. But behind the glimmering interviews and photo ops, something inside him was drifting out of focus. Friends described him as electric, a force that shifted the air when he walked into a room. Directors called him limitless. Michelle Williams, the mother of his child, said he could fill up a space just by being. But toward the end, there were shadows trailing his light. Not long after wrapping I'm Not There, where he portrayed a version of Bob Dylan, Heath began telling close friends he felt hollow. "I don't know who I am when the cameras stop." He confided to one. There were whispers, even then, that something was coming undone. The smile, that famous smile, was no longer resting easily on his face. In public, he could summon it like a reflex, and cameras caught it endlessly. But in private, his expression grew still, heavy. His assistant said it was like watching someone perform happiness instead of feel it. There were moments he would vanish mid-conversation, eyes glassing over before he'd mutter something distracted and walk away. He was no longer living with Michelle. Their separation was gentle in words, but devastating in effect. The birth of their daughter Matilda had lit something sacred in him. "She's the best thing I've ever done," he once said, voice softening into something vulnerable. But the distance from Michelle and the child they shared tore open an emotional fault line. He would fly back and forth, making time, keeping promises. But every time he left, he carried more ache in his bones. A photograph began to circulate. Paparazzi snapped him in London, huddled in a hoodie, head bowed, walking barefoot in the street. He was smiling, but the eyes were vacant, almost pleading. Fans called it quirky, but those who knew him saw it as a man unraveling gently, quietly, in the open. Insomnia had wrapped its claws deeper into his life. He couldn't sleep, even when he tried. "I lay in bed for hours, and my mind just won't stop," he told the New York Times in one of his last interviews. "My body is exhausted, but my brain is going at 1,000 miles an hour." He was working through time zones, memorizing monologues, drifting between personas. The inside of his mind had become a theater with no stagehands, just lights flickering, curtains half drawn. In the margins of his notebooks, cryptic phrases began to appear. "I am not me. Too loud inside. I need silence." Drawings of clocks, repetitive spirals, a figure without a face. Those closest to him noticed that when he did smile, truly smile, it often came when he was with Matilda. There's a home video few have seen Heath kneeling beside her in a sunlit kitchen, coaxing her to laugh by sticking cereal to his nose. His voice is soft, almost reverent. In that clip, he seems whole again, alive in a way that made everything else appear distant. But those moments were fleeting. In the final weeks, there were missed calls, texts that went unanswered, rumors of strange company, long nights, and quiet tears on film sets. A colleague remembered seeing him after a shoot, eyes bloodshot, asking for sleeping pills strong enough to knock out an elephant. They laughed. Ledger didn't. Behind the easy charm and raw genius, there was a man losing the tether to himself. And though no one could pinpoint exactly when the smile became a mask, by the time they did, it was already too late. In the mirror of fame, no reflection is truly reliable. The world saw Heath Ledger ascending, but somewhere in the silent corridors of his heart, a descent had already begun. The bedroom was still, the kind of stillness that feels staged. On the polished nightstand beside Heath Ledger's bed were 6 small bottles, quiet, unassuming, each with a different label. The names printed weren't all his. 2 were prescribed to aliases, a trick common in Hollywood to protect privacy. But beneath the printed layers was something far less ordinary, a pharmacological storm waiting to be deciphered. There were oxycodone and hydrocodone, both powerful opioids, normally reserved for post-surgical pain or terminal illness. There was diazepam and alprazolam Valium and Xanax used to calm the nerves, to slow the spinning inside the skull. Temazepam, a sleep aid, meant for nights when the brain refused to yield, and doxylamine, an antihistamine sometimes used off-label to induce drowsiness. Each drug, alone, might have been a bandage. Together, They formed a noose. The coroner's report would later state the cause of death, plainly acute intoxication from the combined effects of these 6 substances. No sign of foul play, no visible trauma. The toxicology ruled it accidental. But the word accidental seemed to echo with doubt. For how does one accidentally orchestrate such a precise chemical blend? There was no suicide note, no dramatic flourish, just the bottles, the silence, and a man finally at rest. But those who knew Heath Ledger couldn't help but return to the question that never quite fit. How does someone with so much fall so quietly into nothing? One of his closest friends later recalled that Heath had a habit: he would place the pills for the night in a perfect line before bed. Not haphazardly, not in a clump, but lined white, orange, blue like chess pieces. He was trying to solve sleep like a puzzle, she said. But the puzzle kept rearranging itself, and Heath didn't get them all from one place. Some were legally prescribed in New York. Others were leftovers from previous doctors in Los Angeles. A few, it was speculated, may have been passed hand to hand. Hollywood, after all, has its own kind of apothecary quiet favors in quiet bottles. There was no alcohol in his system, no illicit drugs, just too much of what should have helped. In one drawer, police found a receipt for a pharmacy visit just days earlier. On the back of it, a scribbled note: sleep, not dream. Whether he wrote it or copied it, no one knew. But the phrase rang familiar. It echoed Hamlet to sleep, perchance to dream. A reference inverted. Sleep, yes, but not dreams, not chaos, just quiet. The irony sat thick in the air. Ledger, who had just finished portraying one of cinema's most iconic madmen, had been searching desperately for control. A quiet room, a still mind, a few hours of peace. But his body, already worn thin from insomnia and stress, couldn't metabolize the cocktail. The pills didn't kill him instantly. Toxicologists would later determine that the effects built slowly, creeping over hours. The opioids depressed his respiration. The benzodiazepines deepened the lull. His breaths likely slowed without him noticing, then stopped altogether. It's a cruel symmetry. The very substances he took to stay afloat pulled him under. In the world of fame, there's always someone to blame. The public pointed fingers at doctors who overprescribed, at friends who missed the signs, at the industry that worshipped his pain on screen but ignored it off. But perhaps the sharpest truth was this: Heath Ledger died of tiredness. Profound, unbearable, soul-deep tiredness. Not the kind that rest cures, but the kind that dissolves your sense of being. And so the question lingers not just in headlines, but in hearts. Was it truly an accident? Or was it the inevitable result of a man trying too hard, for too long, to be everything everyone else needed him to be, except at peace with himself? Outside, snow gathered on windowsills. Inside, the nightstand held its secrets in amber bottles, lined like mourners in a chapel no one had entered in time. On the set of The Dark Knight, something strange began to happen. Heath Ledger, so often playful between takes on previous films, grew quiet, withdrawn, even spectral. He wasn't just playing the Joker, he was becoming him. The crew whispered about it at lunch tables. Makeup artists noticed his face barely moved beneath the layers of prosthetics. His eyes, beneath the blackened sockets, didn't blink often enough. One technician later admitted he never left the character, not even when the cameras stopped. Ledger had told reporters he wanted to create a Joker that was a psychopathic, mass-murdering, schizophrenic clown with zero empathy. He studied footage of hyenas, read about dictators, and isolated himself in a London hotel room for weeks, keeping a notebook of twisted phrases and grotesque ideas. On the inside cover, he scrawled one word in block letters: chaos. That notebook became a kind of shrine, a diary of dissent. Inside were drawings of dead insects, photos of accidents, snipped headlines, and quotes from A Clockwork Orange. He'd test voices late at night, laughing into mirrors until it curdled into something broken. Neighbors heard strange cackling, followed by silence. One entry stood out, "I'm going to the depths. Wish me luck." The transformation was undeniable. His performance was mesmerizing, yet something about it felt haunted. Director Christopher Nolan spoke delicately about it later, saying Heath threw himself in completely, without fear. But there was a cost. Ledger's physical appearance changed. Weight dropped. Dark circles formed under his eyes, and that radiant energy dulled into something flickering. Castmates would find him sitting alone on set, scribbling, humming, talking under his breath. When the role was done, Ledger didn't celebrate. Instead, he moved restlessly from one city to another, as if trying to shake something off. "I can't stop thinking like him," he admitted to friends. One described a night where Heath laughed at nothing for 10 minutes straight, then suddenly covered his face and whispered, "Sorry, that wasn't me." There is a myth in Hollywood about roles that consume, of Brandon Lee, of Bela Lugosi, now of Heath. But Ledger didn't believe in curses. He believed in craft. And yet something from the Joker clung to him, a residue like smoke on a coat, like a voice that echoed even in sleep. He spoke often about his insomnia during filming. "I took Ambien, 2, 3 a night, and still couldn't sleep," he said. "My mind just kept going." There were nights he sat in his kitchen until dawn, staring at a mug of untouched tea, the makeup from set still faintly outlining his mouth. The character had burrowed beneath his skin. One friend, visiting him in New York, remembered a moment at a restaurant. Heath stared at a child across the room watching, expression blank. Then he said, with no smile, "He doesn't know the world is broken yet." The words hung heavy in the air. The conversation never recovered. When the trailer for The Dark Knight was released posthumously, the world gasped. His voice the rasp. The sinister drawl felt almost inhuman. It was genius, it was terrifying, and it was the last gift of a man who had torn something out of himself to give it. Ledger would never see the full cut, would never feel the ovation, would never hold the Oscar. The role made him immortal, but it may have helped kill the man. And in quiet moments, those who knew him best still wonder, did the Joker ever leave the room? The most curious detail of Heath Ledger's final day didn't lie in his bedroom, or the coroner's report, or even the autopsy findings. It lived in the sequence of phone calls made after he was found unresponsive, and in who was called first. At 3:00 p.m., as the massage therapist arrived at Ledger's apartment, she was let in by the housekeeper. Both women believed Heath was merely sleeping. The bedroom door was unlocked, but when the masseuse entered the room, she noticed the stillness too still and the weight of his limbs, unnaturally heavy. Instead of dialing 911 immediately, she picked up Ledger's phone and called Mary-Kate Olsen, not once, but twice, before finally alerting emergency services. The question took root quickly and has never left. Why her? Mary-Kate Olsen was not his girlfriend. She wasn't his relative. Their relationship had never been public in any meaningful way. Some sources would later describe them as casually involved, others as simply close friends. But whatever their connection, it was intimate enough that, in a moment of crisis, her name was the first to come to mind. The calls lasted under a minute each. No answers, no voicemails, just ringing into the void. Within minutes of the third call, this time to emergency responders, Mary-Kate had arranged for her own private security team to head to the apartment. Not police, not paramedics, her people. And they arrived before Ledger was pronounced dead. This strange choreography, the skipped 911 call, the delayed report, The shadowy response cast a long shadow over an already fragile narrative. When questioned, Olsen refused to speak publicly. Through her lawyers, she declined repeated requests to be interviewed by federal investigators unless she was granted full immunity from prosecution. Immunity for what? The question echoed, but never found solid ground. There was no indication she had provided Heath the medications, and officials eventually dropped the issue. But the unease lingered. What did she know that she was so afraid to say aloud? Conspiracy theories bloomed quickly, like mold in corners, that Mary-Kate had access to prescription drugs through high-end Hollywood doctors, that her name was attached to one of the bottles, that she'd been at the apartment earlier and left before the masseuse arrived. None of these theories ever solidified into facts, but the vacuum of truth gave them air. The media swarmed. Paparazzi chased her down alleyways. Olsen disappeared from public view for weeks, retreating into silence. The whisper campaign only grew. Ledger's family, meanwhile, said nothing. His father, Kim Ledger, with characteristic restraint, refused to speculate. "We can't change anything," he said. "We just miss him." But those inside the inner circle couldn't shake the sense that something had gone unsaid. Something gently, deliberately buried. In the days after Heath's death, the press feasted on Mary-Kate's name, dragging her into a tragedy she never publicly claimed. She became the woman on the other end of the line, the person who didn't answer, whose security arrived before help, whose silence seemed carved in stone. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was nothing more than the instinct of a young woman raised in the unforgiving light of fame, knowing that to speak is to bleed. But in the theater of Ledger's death, Mary-Kate's brief, invisible appearance became a scene unto itself, haunting, because it lacked clarity. A phone ringing in a pocket somewhere, a choice made in seconds, an echo that would last forever. The call log is time-stamped. The masseuse's testimony is consistent. The security detail confirmed. And yet, the motive remains elusive, like a figure in fog, visible only by shape, never by face. In a death defined by fragments, this was perhaps the sharpest shard. The person called first was not the one who could save him, only the one who might have known why. Before the stillness of that New York apartment, before the Joker's face became legend, there was Sydney. In the weeks preceding his death, Heath Ledger returned to his homeland, a visit that, to some, seemed like a brief reprieve, but to others felt more like a slow unraveling. Sydney in December is bright, burning, restless. Tourists gather along the harbor, beaches shimmer. But Heath moved through the city like a ghost retracing forgotten paths. He rented a suite at the luxurious Soho Hotel in Woolloomooloo, but he didn't seem to rest. Staff remembered him as polite, quiet, but sleepless. He rarely left during the day. The curtains remained drawn. Friends in Australia, people who had known him before the fame, noticed the difference instantly. The energy that once defined him, the boyish chaos, the magnetic laughter, it was still there in flashes, but dulled, like a candle flickering through tinted glass. One night, a friend said, they found Heath staring at the ocean from a balcony, shoeless, even though the pavement was hot. He didn't say much, just muttered, "I miss the feeling of disappearing." There were signs, small but insistent, that something was off. He skipped appointments, canceled meetings with producers. A hotel worker later described finding a journal left open beside his bed, pages scribbled with jagged sketches, broken lines of poetry, and loops of repetition. The same phrase, over and over, "I can't shut it off." Ledger was supposed to spend Christmas with his family, but the mood was fractured. His separation from Michelle Williams had carved a silence into the space between them, and that silence followed him. His sister Kate, always close, always intuitive, grew concerned. She told him to slow down, that he didn't seem right. She would later recall their last conversation, over the phone, just days before he flew back to New York. "I love you," she told him. "I know," he said. "Don't worry, I'm okay." Then he paused and added, "I'll sleep better when I'm back." But when he did return to New York, sleep still eluded him. During those final days in Sydney, strange stories began to circulate of Heath appearing at bars alone, ordering tea and sitting for hours without speaking to anyone, of him wandering hotel corridors barefoot, scribbling in a moleskin journal, of a moment when he told a friend he was starting to forget which life was mine. It wasn't drugs, it wasn't alcohol. His toxicology in those weeks was clean. He was lucid, but something deeper was happening, a kind of psychic fatigue that no substance could numb. One evening, after a long walk through Paddington, Heath visited his childhood home. The house had changed hands long ago, but he stood across the street for several minutes, unmoving. A neighbor saw him and waved. He didn't wave back. In the myth of the actor, there's a romantic notion of burning too bright. But what Ledger was experiencing wasn't fire. It was dissolution, a slow erosion of the line between self and character, between stage and reality. He had always been a shapeshifter, jumping between roles, dialects, continents. But now, the shifting wouldn't stop. In a cafe in Surrey Hills, someone overheard him murmuring lines to himself in a voice that wasn't his. Not quite Joker, not quite Dylan, something in between. The barista, not recognizing him at first, said he looked like a man trying to rehearse how to exist. When he finally left Sydney, it was quiet. No fanfare, no press. Just a single flight booked under a pseudonym and a driver waiting at JFK. Back in New York, the journal he'd carried with him was found beside his bed. In it, a final page, a child's drawing Matilda had made, folded inside. No writing, just the picture, and the familiar looping spiral he'd sketched so often. This one smaller, tighter, as if something inside him had folded in completely. The call came in the middle of the night, Australian time. Kim Ledger was used to odd hours. Heath's world operated across continents, but this one felt wrong even before he picked up. The voice on the line trembled. The words didn't register at first. Then came the phrase that would carve itself into his memory forever. He's gone. The father of a famous son learns to live in two worlds, one public, one private. One where his child is a headline, the other where he is still just a boy in a backyard, jumping into a pool, laughing through missing teeth. In the hours after Heath's death became global news. Kim Ledger stood before microphones, reporters, flashing cameras, but inside, he was suspended in the silence of a final voicemail. That voicemail had come only days earlier. Heath's voice, unmistakably calm, had said something simple, something ordinary. He talked about missing Matilda, about wanting to come visit Perth soon. He ended the message with, "I'll call you later." Dad later never came. Kim played that voicemail again and again, listening not to the words, but to the gaps in between, the pauses, the slight strain in Heath's throat, the way he hesitated, just a beat too long, before saying goodbye. It wasn't a farewell, but it wasn't quite casual either. As a young boy, Heath had been ceaseless energy, a blur of motion. Acting had come early, but even before the stage, there had been a kind of performance in him, a mimicry, a hunger to become. Kim remembered the first time Heath impersonated someone, just to make his sister laugh. He wanted to feel everything. Kim once said, he didn't know how to shut it off. Now, the silence was permanent. The news anchors dissected his death with surgical precision, listing drug names, quoting anonymous sources, flashing photos from red carpets. But none of it sounded like his son. None of it captured the boy who used to sit cross-legged on the kitchen floor, teaching his niece how to juggle with apples. The boy who had built towers of Legos taller than himself, who had once refused to go to sleep until his father promised there were no monsters under the bed. Kim began to retreat, not from grief, but from noise. He stopped reading tabloids. He answered only the necessary calls. Instead, he took long drives without destination, winding through the outer edges of Perth, where the eucalyptus trees swayed like silent mourners. In interviews, when asked how he was coping, he never indulged sentimentality. "You just keep breathing," he would say. But behind his eyes was a depth of unspoken ache. Regret is a peculiar companion. It doesn't accuse. It just waits. Waits for quiet moments, for long silences at the dinner table, for the sound of a voicemail that will never play again. Heath's funeral was held in Australia, away from the public eye. His body was cremated, his ashes scattered in a family plot near Cottesloe Beach, where he had once surfed as a teenager. The water there, on the day of his farewell, was unusually calm. The sky dimmed early. Kim carried a copy of The Dark Knight script Heath had given him. Dog-eared, annotated, covered in handwritten notes. He read some of it aloud, later, in private. There was a line Heath had underlined twice. "You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain." It was a haunting choice, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way they sat in the margins, as if Heath had known they would outlive him. Kim Ledger never blamed anyone, not Mary-Kate, not the doctors, not even the system. He once said, quietly, Heath was trying to fix himself. He just ran out of time. And perhaps that is the sharpest edge of grief, not the loss itself, but the unasked question. Was there a moment I could have done something more? A different tone in a voicemail. One extra call, a longer pause before hanging up. But the past does not negotiate. It only echoes. And for a father left behind, that echo is sometimes the only thing left to hold. After Heath Ledger's death, his belongings were packed with reverence, item by item, as though the silence might break if handled too carelessly. Among scripts and clothing, music and photographs, there was one object that stood apart, a battered, spiral-bound composition notebook. Its black cover worn at the edges like something handled too many times, too tightly. Inside were fragments of a mind slipping between worlds. It was not a journal in the traditional sense. There were no dated entries, no coherent thoughts threaded through paragraphs. Instead, it was a collage of unsettling textures, childish sketches of clowns with ink-smeared eyes, newspaper clippings of car crashes and war zones glued between pages, scribbled lines of dialogue, and words written again and again until their meaning seemed to rot under repetition. One page simply read, over and over, "Why so serious?" Another bye-bye, capital letters, no punctuation, as though the words were being shouted from inside a closed room. Some of the drawings were eerily symmetrical, perfect circles filled with chaos, mirrors reflecting nothing. Others were crude, grotesque, made with frantic pen strokes that tore the page beneath. There was a list of medications, crossed out, rewritten, crossed out again. Ledger had always kept notebooks for his characters. He called them empathy maps, a place to feel through the person he was becoming. But this one, created during his immersion into the Joker, was different. It wasn't method, it was possession. The notebook began in structure, lists, questions, notes on psychology. But as the pages advanced, the writing grew looser, more erratic. A line jutted across 3 pages. It's not pretend if the thoughts are real. Tucked in the back was a faded Polaroid Heath in makeup. Joker smile. Staring straight into the lens, head slightly tilted. No expression in the eyes. On the back, he had written, "Found him." Friends and colleagues who saw the notebook described it as brilliant, disturbing, intimate. Some couldn't look at it for long. Others felt compelled to read every line, as if understanding the chaos might somehow make sense of the ending. When Christopher Nolan was shown parts of it, he reportedly grew quiet. He was committed. Nolan said, fearlessly committed. But that commitment now seemed like a fall through a door no one else had noticed opening. The most chilling section came at the end. A small series of pages where the words grew faint, as though Ledger had begun to press lighter, or perhaps run out of ink or will. These pages were filled with spirals, dozens of them, drawn in black ink, then red, then pencil, each one tighter than the last, as if something was collapsing, drawing in on itself. And on the final page, thank you, nothing more. There's a superstition in theater: never say the name of Macbeth aloud backstage. It brings bad luck, they say. But Ledger didn't believe in superstitions. He believed in inhabiting, in dissolving into a role so fully that the skin of the character became the skin of the actor. In that sense, the Joker wasn't just a role. It was a mirror reflecting something inside him he'd never wanted to see. Michelle Williams, when asked about The Notebook years later, declined to comment. She once said, softly, he was more than what people saw. He was trying to understand the whole world at once. But The Notebook tells another truth, that sometimes the search for understanding leads to a place beyond return. It remains locked away now, in an archive kept by his family. Private, sacred, not because it hides something dangerous, but because it contains the kind of intimacy that feels too raw to witness. The pages are just ink and paper. Yes, but between them lies the echo of a mind unraveling with beauty, terror, and sincerity. A mind that tried to turn pain into art, and then couldn't find the way back. The autopsy was supposed to bring closure. It didn't. In a small, fluorescent-lit office in Manhattan, a medical examiner studied the body of a man who had, days before, been the epicenter of a cinematic universe. Now, Heath Ledger lay still under a white sheet, his brilliance reduced to vitals and fluids, cold numbers and blood panels. The official conclusion, released nearly 2 weeks after his death, was accidental acute intoxication, a cocktail of 6 medications, none at lethal doses individually, but together, a perfect storm. But if the medical findings were precise, their timing and omissions only deepened the mystery. Why had it taken so long? Why the silence from officials in those crucial early days? And why was the media already flooded with leaked findings before the family had been properly briefed? The word accidental floated atop the report like a thin veneer factual. Perhaps, but emotionally void. For those who loved him, the clinical language grated like sand against glass. To them, Heath hadn't died from a mere accident. He died from exhaustion, from fragmentation, from a culture that praised immersion and ignored collapse. There were inconsistencies that stuck like thorns. His close friend, Gemma, had spoken to him just a day before. He sounded clearer than he had in weeks. She said, he was reading a children's book to Matilda over the phone. He even laughed. Heath's masseuse reported him snoring faintly around 12:30 p.m., suggesting he might have been alive long after the sleeping pills had taken hold. But if so, why didn't he wake? Why didn't his body resist? The answer might lie in the delicate orchestration of substances in his system. The benzodiazepines Xanax, Valium, Restoril slowed brain activity. The opioids oxycodone and hydrocodone depressed respiration. Doxylamine deepened the sedation. Each pill alone might not have been fatal, but together, they created a silent collapse. The kind where you slip beneath the water without ever knowing you're drowning. Conspiracy theorists, ever watchful, fed on the few scraps left ambiguous. They pointed to the initial refusal of Mary-Kate Olsen to cooperate without immunity. They examined the error in early reports that named only 2 drugs, not 6. They whispered about missing surveillance footage from the apartment building, about a secondary phone that had been wiped clean. But more than any of these was the deep emotional contradiction that a man so vibrant, so committed to his craft, so beloved by those around him, had somehow slipped away, quietly unnoticed until it was too late. Michelle Williams never released a statement about the autopsy. She didn't need to. In the days following his death, she retreated entirely, disappearing with their daughter into privacy. A close source said she refused to let Matilda see any footage of the Joker for years. I don't want that to be how she remembers him. And yet that role, that film, became the enduring legacy. An Oscar followed posthumous. Tributes poured in. The industry mourned. But beneath the red carpet memorials and tearful montages, something fragile remained broken. The autopsy did not mention the notebooks. It did not speak of the spirals. It did not account for the sleepless nights, the fractured identity, the subtle withdrawal from life. It could not quantify grief, or soul, or weariness. There's a clinical term for the manner of death in such cases: accidental polypharmacy. But that word is too small to contain the storm that was Heath Ledger's final descent. It implies chaos, not choice, disorder, not despair. But maybe that was the truth. Maybe Heath never meant to leave only to pause, to hush the noise just long enough to rest. And maybe, tragically, he succeeded too well. The echoes of his death linger in strange places in interviews replayed with tragic hindsight, in scenes where his eyes flash something that now seems prophetic, in unanswered voicemails kept too long on old machines. But mostly, they linger in the space he left behind, a void shaped like a young man on the cusp of becoming something greater than fame, something deeper than performance. The autopsy closed the case, but the story never quite followed. Years have passed, and yet Heath Ledger remains suspended in a peculiar kind of time, neither gone nor present, a face flickering between memory and mythology. His name still carries the weight of unfinished sentences. His smile, immortalized on screens, belongs now to a man the world never fully knew. Those closest to him still speak of him cautiously, as if words might disturb something sacred. Michelle Williams, in rare reflections, avoids trying to explain him. "Some things are too big for language," she once said, eyes lowered. Matilda, now older, carries his features, the same eyes, the same unruly energy, but has grown in a world designed to protect her from the weight of his shadow. The Joker remains Ledger's most iconic role, but to those who loved him, it's a misrepresentation. They remember the man who strummed guitars barefoot, who painted with his daughter, who cried at movies, who danced without music. A man who lived messily, fully, restlessly. A man who was more than his darkness. And yet, it's impossible to separate the brilliance from the burn. Heath Ledger did not fade. He flared suddenly, beautifully, devastatingly. He left behind no manifesto, no dramatic exit, just pages of sketches, fragments of laughter, phone messages, scripts annotated in the margins, a life preserved in pieces. At the time of his death, he had begun working on a documentary of his own, something raw and unfiltered about fame and identity. Footage exists. Heath behind the camera, asking questions no one could quite answer. "Who are you when no one's watching?" he asked. "And who are you when everyone is?" That duality haunted him, the self and the performance, the man and the myth. In Hollywood, tragedy often becomes a marketing tool. Posthumous fame is romanticized, but Ledger's legacy resisted simplification. He was too complex, too contradictory. He had been a teenage heartthrob, an indie darling, a blockbuster villain, a father, a recluse, a seeker, and perhaps most poignantly, a man undone not by scandal or spectacle, but by quiet, accumulating pain. There is a scene in The Dark Knight where the Joker says, "I'm not a monster, I'm just ahead of the curve." Ledger didn't write that line, but somehow it fits. He saw something in the curve of fame, of pressure, of expectation, and it pulled him somewhere the rest of us couldn't follow. To this day, some friends say they still sense him, not in ghosts, but in unfinished conversations, in the urge to send a message, to make a call, to look for his name in a contact list that will never ring again. Grief, after all, is not only sorrow, it's continuity interrupted. One close friend described a dream she had, a year after his death. In it, Heath was barefoot, walking across a stage, a cigarette in one hand, a child's drawing in the other. He didn't speak. He just smiled softly, like he understood something no one else did, and walked into the wings. Perhaps that's how he should be remembered. Not as a mystery to solve, not as a cautionary tale, but as a comet bright, wild, and impossibly fast, leaving behind a trail of color too vivid to forget. In the final tally, there were no answers, only echoes. No final lines, only the sound of a door closing softly behind him. The man who burned too bright never dimmed. He simply disappeared into the light.